All right. Oh, sorry. Feels like the voice of God.
I've heard that one before.
Is my audio working? It is. Okay. All right, this is it. By the way, I realized that with the fall bake sale, we won't have ELCA for sure on December 10th. So my gut instinct is to do something next week, which is yet to be determined, and then we'll be done until, I don't know, second week in January or something like that. Just heads up. Because we would do something next week, we'd have the 10th off, and then it would be the week before Christmas. So that's the plan. But today, we're going to wrap up our history of early history of early Christianity. What I want to spend most of today on is just kind of talking about the impact of learning learning this history of our church has changed your perspective, or just general thought. It doesn't. I shouldn't be that pointed in my questioning. Sorry, how are you? Everybody have a good Thanksgiving? Yeah. Good. Anybody travel? I know Matt did, yeah. Oh, almost everybody. You went to Chelan, didn't you? Or?
Went up to Chelan.
Yeah, Ricky went up to Chelan.
I went to Woodstock.
What's that?
I went to Woodstock.
I know, I was trying to come up with a joke about whether you saw Jimi Hendrix or not, you know. I didn't know they were doing another, yeah. Cool. Yeah, we drove up to Bellevue, Washington. We have friends up there. I was telling Matt and Mike, yeah, these friends we have done Thanksgiving with for like the past 4 or 5 years. Yeah, so it's kind of become a tradition. But they moved to Bellevue. They used to be in Maple Valley. They moved to Bellevue about a year ago. They bought a new house, but the house is still in the process of being renovated a bit. So they were a little bit stressed that whether it would work, but it worked great. We brought our dogs up with us, so there were 3 dogs running around and 2 kids. They've got 2 daughters. One's 9, one's 6.
Did they put you to work?
I mean, I always end up cooking in one form or another.
No, I mean renovating.
Oh no. Well, I actually did. Matthew wanted to install a new. I hope he's not watching this. He wanted to install a smart thermostat. He bought one of those Ecobee ones, and he accidentally blew the fuse on his control module on his furnace.
Oh no.
Yeah. Right after we had just got there, and he was messing around with the thermostat. And what he did is he didn't trace his lines, and he actually sent power. This is probably meaningless to most of you, but he sent power from the control module. And I don't know, you know how old houses get weird stuff? They have like a recirculation pump, and the way they have wired it is it ran from the control module to the recirculation pump, and then to the thermostat. I have no idea why, especially since the recirc pump has a 110 plug, right? So what he did accidentally is he essentially ran it from the control module to the recirc pump back into the control module. So he ran 110 back into the blew a fuse, was panicking because he thought we were going to be without heat for the entire weekend. But luckily, O'Reilly Auto was open, and I bought him 10 3-amp fuses just in case. So to make a long story short, he was not able to install the new thermostat. He was able to reinstall the old thermostat. So crisis averted. So to answer your question, yes, they did put me to work. I made parts run. But yeah, we had a great Thanksgiving, a lot of fun. I'm tired. You stay up late with folks, and being around children for 4 days in a row, something I'm not used to. 2 little girls and 3 dogs. That was enough. All right. Before we get into general conversation, I want to go a little bit further than we did. Where we left off last week is we left off Constantine has assumed power, freed Christianity from the bonds of persecution, and everything is right with the world. And kind of the hanging question that we were left with was, would Christianity survive comfort? And the answer is not really. Well, to put it a different way, Christianity as it was is no longer. Christianity changes almost overnight. And what that looks like, by and large, is that with the threat of persecution lifted, Christians essentially come out of the woodwork to a certain extent, right? They can go in public places, they can go to plays, they can participate in society in a way that they weren't. They can escape the tombs, which is a big part of it, actually, is that, what churches, the buildings of churches looks like changes almost instantly, right? We talked about, the original Christian worship spaces were homes, and then they would gather in Roman, cemeteries, because that was where they could bury their dead, and they were allowed to gather there. There is actually an example of a church building that exists. I can't remember where it's from. I'll look it up later. But it was just a simple four walls and a roof, right? One of the things that we didn't really talk about because it didn't come up. Hold on, I should probably pull up my notes. I put the cart before the horse. I got the live stream going before I started thinking about things. In there where they worship, what did that look like? And the answer is not much. I mean, essentially anywhere that they could congregate with people, that's where they met. So there, we have, if you go into any church, there is a ritual layout to it, right? That doesn't exist before Constantine, right? The altars, the aisles. I mean, even what we laughingly, joke about what our traditional Lutheran churches look like with pews and, rows of seats and all that stuff, does not exist, right? They may have had seats, but by and large, the purpose was to gather with your people and to share in a meal. So however that functionally worked, that's what you did. One of the things that changes when Roman imperial authority, starts to work hand in hand with Christianity, which, by the way, takes a long time. So Constantine is beginning of the 4th century. The relationship between Christianity and the empire is in and out for the next 80 so odd years, right? Up until about 390 is when Christianity one of the misnomers, well, it's not really a misnomer, one of the misconceptions is that Christianity never really becomes the official state religion in a way that we think of it with national units having state religions nowadays. The kind of nail in the coffin, is essentially around 390 is the banning of pagan worship, which is, Christianity becoming the state religion, so to speak, which we'll get there in a second. Over those intervening years between Constantine and the banning of pagan worship, it's like 390 or 393, something like that. You have a succession of emperors. So Constantine's sons take over after Constantine dies, and then there's a series of emperors. And it's in and out between those that support Christianity and participate in Christianity. And there's one guy, Julian, who tries to return to the pagan practices and is reviled. Julian wasn't super popular. Is the Julian calendar named after Julian? I think it is. Interesting. That just occurred to me. Anyhow, Constantine's sons are both baptized. Most of the emperors after Constantine are supporters of, if not participants in Christianity outright. But what happens over those 80 years as you have Christianity evolving, changing in this new environment, is it grows in ways other than numbers, right? So you need new leadership. If you've got an official, practicing Christianity, now you need to have an official, hierarchy. And a lot of these things, keep in mind, a lot of these things occur because you now have empire and church working hand in hand. Yeah. And the hanging question there is it empire and church working hand in hand, or is it empire and church? Right? Yeah. Okay. And of course, I'm biased. I think this is kind of what happens, is that the empire takes control of this, what used to be this wild and organic religion. So, going back to my earlier question, one of the things that changes is the buildings themselves. So the concept of a basilica, right, comes out of this period, which is, as they start to build official church buildings, guess what they model them after? Pagan temples. This is the first time that you begin to have leaders who are called priests. Okay? And guess where they take that name from? The priests of the pagan temples, right? Altars. Okay? One of the things that we take for granted existing in every church does not enter into church architecture until after Constantine, because the altar is in the pagan temple, right?
But altars were also in the Jewish tradition.
Absolutely, absolutely.
But they function differently, didn't they?
Well, yes and no. Altars were tables of sacrifice.
Right, yeah.
Right? One of the things that Christianity, in its primitive form, right, the early Christianity that exists before the 4th century, is that the center of their worship was the meal, right? Not the altar, right? So, and again, what happens here is altars come into churches because you've got kind of the syncretism that's occurring with the practices of the empire, with the practices of the church. But the altar is now where the meal is prepared. Right? So it's really fascinating how this occurs. The other things that we don't think about, you never kneeled on Sunday morning, because Sunday morning was when you were celebrating. You were celebrating the resurrection. You don't need to kneel, you're standing up and rejoicing. But you kneeled before the emperor, right? Before Sol Invictus. So you begin kneeling for prayer on Sunday mornings. Processionals, right? You did not process into a gathering for to commune, but now at the beginning of the service, you process in because that's what you did in the court of the emperor, right? So, and again, it's not to say that the things that we do are bad, but it's where did they come from? And this is where it came from, is Christianity, like it has done for over 300 years, is now mixing with the culture that it has begun to cooperate with, and this is now informing this, right? Which is, I made a joke well, it wasn't a joke, it's more of a comment, but,
You laughed.
I laughed. But, in a lot of ways, Constantine is the best thing that ever happened to Christians and the worst thing that ever happened to the church. Christianity now gets to practice and express freely, but now it is taking on the form of the culture in which it exists. Bishops, hierarchy, right? Leadership pre-Constantine was pretty organic, right? You had leaders that came out of the community, and the style of leadership depended on where that community existed. Yes, you had quote-unquote bishops, but a lot of communities were led by a group of presbyters, a group of elders, right? Some were even, especially in Italian, the Italian churches, they were led by papas, popes, right? But now you need to have official hierarchical structure. So what they end up doing is they essentially end up creating regional offices and filling them with bishops. So they end up having around 1,200 bishops across the empire. And again, this doesn't happen overnight. This happens over the course of about 80 years, right? And, it's kind of remarkable how quickly it happens.
Yeah, I was just
I mean, think about it. It takes 300 years for the church to become what it is by Constantine, but in the course of, again, just about 80 years, it changes significantly in a way that it had not before that. The other thing that occurs during this is the question of theology. Okay, and I'm not going to get into the woods with this one, but one of the big conflicts of theology that happens over the course of the 4th century, which ends up being rejected, is Arianism, not to be confused with Nazis. It has nothing to do with the Aryan with a Y, race. Okay, Arianism is a theological controversy about the nature of the godhood. Okay, we're not going to get into the weeds on that. If we end up doing Constantine to Luther, we'll talk about Arianism. But this ends up being rejected, but this is the major source of debate over the course of the 4th century. Okay? And well, one of the other things that happens as a precursor to the outlawing of paganism is the outlawing of images. Right? That's how it starts. Is one of the emperors, I can't remember which one, outlaws images. So one of the consequences of this is all of these statues to Zeus and Apollo, et cetera, are torn down, right? The statues of the emperor take a little bit longer, but they never really get torn down because what happens is the imagery, the imperial imagery, ends up getting merged with images of Christ, right? So a lot of the royal imagery that we take for granted, especially in our medieval artwork, right? Crowns, rods, staves, even if you look at a lot of the Eastern iconography, right, with all the, the baby and holding that weird little ball with the cross on top, I can never remember what it's called, that comes straight out of Imperial Rome, right? So you get this merging, which is, if you think about it, really ironic and rather tragic, considering that the book of Revelation, right, is written to ape and mock imperial imagery, right, as a contrast to Christian, to the reality of Christ. Okay, so yeah, in a lot of ways, Christianity kind of makes a deal with the devil over the course of the. That's my opinion. That's my opinion. Here's one of the other really unfortunate consequences: is that as Christianity rises to prominence and paganism fades into memory, Christians begin persecuting pagans, okay, and Jews. So over the course of those 80 years, right, as Christianity becomes the norm, suddenly Christianity feels the need to correct those who are not the norm, right? And so what you have is you have real violence done, especially towards the end of the 4th century. There's a guy named Bishop Theophilus, which is really tragic, named literally loved by God, or loving God, who basically goes around and tears down the remaining pagan temple and essentially leads a mob of people that arrest and kill any pagan worshipers that they find, right? And of course, what happens when you create roving mobs of people trying to enforce monotheistic practice, as we see now in modern eras as well too, is it gets beyond their control and it turns into essentially a witch hunt, before there were witches. Yay! Right? So that's what happened, and it's not all bad, right? Again, I'm kind of putting a bit of a negative bent to it, but it's not all bad because on the flip side of it, right, is now Christianity is free to practice without fear of these things that existed before, without fear of persecution or arrest. And so Christian art, right, these things that we take for granted, having had them for 1,600 odd years, Christian art, Christian ritual, all of these things that are now part of our tradition, they bloom and blossom during this time period, right? It's just that, some of it goes hand in hand with this. And again, this doesn't mean that it's default bad, right? But what we're trying to do here is understand where our stuff comes from, right? So one of the realities for us is our worship space, as it is as much informed by Roman imperial imagery as it is by Christian theology, right? But it's also informed by a lot of things, right? Because the church doesn't stop evolving in the 4th century, right? Our Lutheran church spaces are informed by German culture, Scandinavian culture, right? With the default Lutheran, one of the default Lutheran worship spaces is the overturned ship ceiling, Have you been in those? And that comes from our Scandinavian forebears, who literally would just turn ships upside down to make buildings. That's how that worked. So yeah, I mean, we're constantly receiving influence. And if you think about, for example, megachurch worship spaces, what are those influenced by? Right? Stadiums, sports centers, conference centers. This is the thing I always get a kick out of. On occasion, and it's never intentionally, I happen to find myself watching televangelists in one form or another, or watching one of the big stadium church services. I always think I'm watching a TED Talk until I realize what they're talking about, and then I change the channel. Sorry, being snarky a little bit, right? But I mean, this is kind of the interesting question to ask: is, you know, what are we influenced by? Where does this stuff come from? Because the reality is that what Christianity looks like nowadays, its buildings, its practices, its beliefs even, are not original to Christianity as it existed in those first 300 years. So much of it is culture, I don't want to use the word intruding, but influencing what we consider to be Christianity. And so, you know, one of my things, I'm almost done, you know, so one of my things is always, when we get hung up, right, on it has to be this way, when it comes to our buildings or our practices, or a lot of times our beliefs, an important question to ask is why? And where does that come from? Because it gets so conflicted sometimes, where we get knocked down, drag out fights over things like whether there should be kneelers. But when you realize that kneeling doesn't become a practice until Rome insists on it in church services, is it really that important? That's not to say you can't have kneelers, right? If that's a part of your spiritual practice, if that's important to you, go for it. You can kneel through the whole darn service if you want. I don't care. But if it becomes something where you insist on it, and you insist on other people participating in that practice, because it's the right, you know, the right thing to do, well, I hate to break it to you, but you may not want to know where that practice originates from, because it will be very highly disappointing to you.
And you're gonna have to help all of us get up.
And you're going to have to, exactly. Were there ever kneelers in Milwaukie Lutheran? I mean, we kneel at the rail. When we commune at the rail. But were there ever kneelers? Okay. My home church had kneelers at one point.
St. Stephen's had kneelers out in Glasgow.
Did they?
Yeah.
Were they the flip down ones, or were they the built-in ones?
Flip down.
Flip down. Yeah. Yeah. We had the flip, Lear Lutheran had the flip down ones, I think. We never had the built-in.
All the churches when I was growing up had kneelers.
Yeah. Do you remember what parts of the service you kneeled at? I'm trying to remember it.
When you start
The Eucharistic prayer? Yeah. Yeah, that sounds right. Yeah. Yeah, I think it was just, I don't know. Yeah, it's been a long time. Yeah, it's been a long time since I participated in the Catholic worship as well, too. Because otherwise that would, you know, there's lots of that in there. Like genuflecting. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So that's it. What do you think about all this?
Super interesting.
Yeah, I know. I mean, this is like the perfect Venn diagram of all the things I love. History, Christianity, theology, culture, society. I love this stuff. But that's just me.
Well, I think it informs us of where we sit, and maybe that we should be more embracive of our own community in our worship.
That is really fascinating. That's a really insightful remark.
I mean, it's kind of like you working with the middle school,
Yeah.
or I don't know. I think that we need to do that. That's what community is about.
The reason I think that is a really important comment is one of the reactions to studying stuff like this, and I'm guilty of this as well, is I'm like, well, how do we get back to the way that it really used to be? Right? Yeah.
Well, and to that point, obviously our culture has influenced our religion.
Yeah.
Our religion has influenced our culture.
Yes.
Enormously also.
Yes. It's not a one-way. It's not a one-way
That's a
street.
living thing.
Yes. Oh, yeah. That's an important term. And this is a concept that runs counter to a lot of the things that we get stuck on, which is that when you get into arguments about what the right thing is, often that comes out of this idea that there was the one true way, right? This concept says the opposite, which is that the right way is the way that is right, is right for us in this moment. And I think it's always a bit of, it's a bit of a dance, right? So in Lutheran philosophy and thought, we always talk about the two ditches, right? So it's never one straight path. You're always, when you're trying to understand stuff, you're always navigating between two poles, right? Two extremes, right? What do you think, Paul?
I had this idea all my life, and I kind of see partly where it came from because I was raised from infancy in the church, and it's always been relatively easy for me to look at both sides, or a spectrum,
Yeah.
instead of, I don't know, television, and it also leads to a lot of confusion.
Yes. Where do you end up finding yourself in confusion?
Say that again?
You said it leads to a lot of confusion. Where do you often find yourself in confusion?
It's difficult having a broad view.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of people around you.
Yes, it is.
Like, for instance, my working years, I was one of the closet Republicans in my school.
In a school that was much more progressive.
Pretty democratic.
Yeah.
Yeah, things like that.
How did you handle that?
I didn't say too much.
Isn't that the truth though? I mean, that it really is, depending on whether you're the majority or the minority, right? And again, this is hilarious because this is exactly what happens, right, over the course of the 4th century.
And when Mr. Trump won his election, they had the chalkboard in the faculty lounge almost covered in black, and we're sorry, and
Oh
with
wow.
you, and lots of sentiments that people wrote up there.
Yeah. And you were wondering what's going on. Yeah.
Well, and it's silencing, like,
Yeah.
and that's really bad. I mean, it's just like the Christians having to hide. It's the same idea. You
Yeah.
gotta have an idea, and no one's listening because you're afraid to speak. It's changed my views on. Well, but it's about speaking your view.
Here's what a broad view is about, though, right? Is understanding that your perspective, right, is not all encompassing.
Yeah.
Right? Because this is what we were talking about. Here's this idea that there is the right thing, right? Which, there should be pews, not chairs. The altar should be removed away from the back wall. And I'm being a little bit snarky here, but these are things that people have gotten to like fistfights about over the course of Christian history, right? Should have a cross. Should Jesus be on the cross? Should it be an empty cross? Right? Do we commune at the rail? Do we commune at the front of the pews? Do you kneel at the rail? I mean, all these things, and people have opinions on them, right? One of the things that understanding our history does to us is it kind of forces us to have this broad view, which is that my view, right? Even thinking of that literally, right? All that I am able to see is not all that there is, right?
So Jesse, instead of saying broad view, could you substitute open mind?
Oh yeah. I mean, I think that's a synonym here. Yeah.
Another thing I've been thinking about lately is the word heritage.
Mm.
And it strikes me that one can add one more dimension in terms of the right and wrong, you know, the good and how close you are to the good, but the beauty. So to the extent that you can find beauty in heritage, that is where you can operate from in terms of recognition and this and that. So, you know, like the land acknowledgement statements are an act of heritage recognition, just as much as us eating lefse, right? It varies.
Yeah, one sec, I'll go to Jim in one.
Yeah, I instead of broad field, I have to work within a community.
Yeah.
I have a certain persona
Yeah.
within a community.
Yeah.
And then I also have my individual.
Yeah.
Things I work through personally. So I feel very comfortable in both realms.
Yeah.
And I value community a whole lot. So I make quote unquote compromise.
Yeah.
That individual. But I think they're both valid.
But I mean, but this is a fascinating thing because this kind of runs counter to this idea, right? To the narrow view, which is when, you know, we all become different people depending on the setting we're in, right? And I would even argue that our opinions change depending on the setting that we're in, right? So for me, if I go back to Alpena, Michigan, and I meet up with the friends I grew up in high school with, it's not so much that, you know, I change 180 degrees, but you know, the cultural opinion that I exist in that point in time is different than if I'm in Portland, Oregon, right? You know, because the conversation is different. And it's tempting to think about that in terms of politics, but it's not really about politics, right? This is something that Alen struggles with, right? So we were talking about this. Well, there's two reasons that she struggles with it. She struggles with it because she's French, and she's still a French person living in the United States. So despite the fact that she's been here more than 20 years, she still at times feels like an alien, right? It's easier when she's in small groups with people that she knows and loves, right? But when she gets into the broad culture, an example of this is she was having lunch with coworkers, and one of them was telling a story about a possum that had invaded his backyard. And he lives, mind you, so I'm not going to tell this, I don't even know this person's name, but he lives in Beaverton, within Beaverton limits, and he shot the possum in his backyard in Beaverton city limits because his wife drove him to it. Well, that's a long story. And they were all laughing because number one, you're not supposed to fire a gun within city limits, you know, but also dealing with possums, it's frustrating, right? Because the first shot did not take care of the possum, and you never know whether a possum is dead or faking it, right? It's kind of joke. So anyways, she was shocked that he had a rifle, right? Well, then she finds out that every one of her coworkers also has a gun. And she's like, what in the world? I don't know these people. Who are they, right? Because in France, owning a weapon is almost unheard of unless you live, you know, in Normandy or in the country and you hunt, which, you know, they don't do a lot of hunting because they don't have wide swaths of untamed forests where people go deer hunting like we do. It's a cultural difference, right? But she also struggles in the smaller sense of that, which is, again, you know, kind of what Jim was talking about, which is she's a French person, and when she's in a community of American people, especially, you know, a lot of our friends are people that she knew from college and were connected to French people in one way or another. Like our friends that we visited for Thanksgiving, Mathieu is French, Ria's from Georgia, which is an interesting combination of folks, right? But she has a hard time sensing the shift, right? From when she's moving from like her comfortable small culture to when she's actually kind of like in American culture, you know, that line is blurred for her.
But you don't even have to be from another country.
No, 100%.
My relatives in a southern state.
100%.
I do not know where their thoughts are.
Yes.
But don't you think as Americans, we are more broadly exposed to different cultures, and so
Absolutely.
as our generations have developed, I mean, from my great grandparents who came from Germany,
Yeah.
they've had to listen to other cultures, work with different
absolutely. I mean,
We're more, we can move from community to community, and I think we need, that's what we need.
well, and here's an example. Here's a contrasting example. Is personally one of the things that I love about our country is how much. I mean, the cliche is that we're a melting pot. I love the idea that there really is no American, right? Because what is American? American is a collection of cultures that have mixed and mingled, and new things have come out of it, right? So in a lot of ways, what for me, what being American is the celebration of our diversity and our diverse, heritages, which is one of the things that I lament when we return to the imperial temptation to want to enforce an American identity, right? Because the contrast with that is, for example, Alain's older sister lives in the east of France. She's a school teacher. And they had a ton of North African immigrants that had come across. And France and Western Europe struggles with immigration because these are smaller national identities. But if you move to France, the expectation is that you will become French. You will speak French, you will participate in French culture and society, you will think French, right? You will think the way the French people do, right? So they are open to immigration, but it's really about assimilation. And they are struggling with that, because guess what happens when you have enough of a critical mass of an immigrant community? Well, guess what? They want to maintain their culture and practices and language and traditions and all the things that go along with that, right? We've struggled with that too. We still struggle with it, but we're better at it. we're better at it, in a lot of ways, because that's our history. Our history is of absorbing peoples. We're not always better at it, I should say. We struggle in the same way, but
we are different in that we are not ethno-national.
we are not. Yes, I agree.
What did she say?
We're not ethno-national. Yeah. Countries like France and Spain and Portugal. And this is I'm not commenting negatively on them, but I'm just saying that can be a struggle. Yeah.
That's why we go visit them.
Exactly. We want to experience that ethno-national culture. Okay, I got off on a tangent. Morning. Yes, right? Like we had, Chinatown. Yeah. And it's great because you can go experience different foods just by moving between neighborhoods. Right? This, by the way, oh my gosh, okay, allow me to vent for 2 minutes. Right? Okay. One of the things with American food culture, one of the shifts over the past 50 years has been towards authenticity, right? The capital A authenticity, right? So one of the things is when immigrants move to a new land, right? They bring their culture and their food with them. A lot of times that culture and that food changes over time, because if you're going to open a restaurant, you have to appeal to the taste of the people that live there. Otherwise, they're not going to eat your food, right? So, you talk about Chinese American, Mexican American, Tex-Mex, all of these fusions of food. And are they authentically, is it the same thing, for example, is Korean food in Beaverton the same exact Korean food that you would eat in Seoul? Probably not, but it's a good, it's a good representation of it, right?
Well,
But
Mexican food we eat here, you do not find in Mexico.
totally, right? But
all the cheese.
Yes, cheese and sugar goes in everything, right? That's the joke about American cuisine, right? But one of the things that I really appreciate about living in America is I can, within the Portland area, sample the cuisines of the entire globe, right? Okay, allow me to vent about France. I love my French family very much. Chinese food in France is French food with different ingredients. That's all it is. Alain's dad had this restaurant, which was the Chinese restaurant, right? Which he loved to go to, mainly because he didn't cook at all. And I went there twice, and both times I walked away just absolutely disgusted from the experience, because it essentially was they cut the beef into small little slivers, but it was in a French brown sauce, right? There was no spice, there was no flavor difference. It did not taste anything like any Asian food that I've ever had. Right? Sorry. Okay. Rant is finished. Okay. So broad view. So one of the things that has that occurs when you understand that Christianity comes out of this really small origins, right? Because like this is the other piece, is that if you rewind, if you trace Christianity back to its origins, it's a group of Jewish men and women, right? Right. One of the things that women are often written out of the histories, but it's a group of very Jewish people, right? And mainly rural, working class Jewish people. That is the cultural origins of Christianity, right? We can watch in real time as Christianity's cultural picture expands, right? All you got to do is read the epistles, right? Because what the epistles are, like Galatians, Romans, Philippians, pick your favorite, that is a snapshot of cultural expansion. Right? It's a snapshot of cultural conflict, where Christianity starts out as this thing, and now it has become this thing. And we focus on the theological aspect of it so often, but it's mostly cultural stuff, right? Can we eat food sacrificed to idols? That seems to be a theological question, but the people that are, wondering why we can't eat food sacrificed to idols, it's like saying, why can't I go tailgate at the Sunday football game, or why can't I go to the Catholic potluck on Fridays, right? Even though I'm Lutheran, is that not copacetic, right? So, and that's just the first 100 years of Christianity. And then as Christianity expands to Turkey and Greece and Rome and Western Europe and Asia and beyond, right? The same thing that we're watching happen nowadays was happening, then as well too, is that it's culturally changing. What happens in the 4th century is in some ways a reversal of that, right? Is that now there is a top-down pressure on that cultural expansion, right? Do you see that happen in our modern era?
I've heard talk of it. I was listening to a gal, and she was talking about the reaction to, the Branch Davidians, maybe it was, or Jim Jones.
Sure.
I think Jim Jones. And it was super reactionary to some of the more vibrant evangelical sorts of expressions.
Sure.
And the evangelical people freak out, and they're like, "Oh no, we have to top down this thing.
Yeah.
We can't be,
Yeah.
jonesing this stuff
Yeah.
up." And it got super conservative because of that fear. So that would be a version, I guess.
Yeah, and I misspoke a little bit. It doesn't necessarily have to be top down, but do you see in the modern experience reaction to the cultural expansion of Christianity? Right. Let me throw an example out there. One of the things that the ELCA has struggled with is, we continue to be the whitest denomination in the United States. Okay, statistically. So we have struggled with incorporating diversity into our worship life. The ways in which we have tried to do that is by training leaders of different cultures, which I think is a great thing. Wonderful, right? Different racial and ethnic backgrounds. Okay. Still, one of the things that we continue to struggle with, despite having trained those leaders, is that when we train leaders of different cultures and they serve communities that gravitate around a leader of that different culture, guess what? They don't look like a Lutheran church in the ways that we so often assume that it would. Does it, because guess what? They bring their cultural practices with them, right? We watched one of these conflicts happen I'm not going to get into that whole gossip story. One of our synods in California had a big blow up because of this, where there was a Latino community and a white community, and the leader of that Latino community was removed from leadership for reasons, and the way in which they handled that was then to bring in white leadership for the Latino community. Okay.
But
So,
it'll change over time. I mean, my great-grandparents and grandparents all grew up in German-speaking Lutheran churches.
exactly.
And then eventually it changed to English, and then the schools changed from
here's my question to you, because I wanted to get at this. Where do you still see the German heritage in those communities? Do you? I shouldn't point that question.
Oh, definitely, because Matt just spent a year working on bylaws. The Germans are like
Yes.
organized.
Well, but this is great, right? I mean, we haven't talked about this, which is church bureaucracy, right? How are our communities even organized? Is the fact that that Lutheranism comes out of Western Europe and Scandinavia, does that influence how our church is organized? 100%, right? 100%. Have you ever, do your...
It's not tribal.
You know,
Like if the biggest population of Lutherans in the United States, in the world right now, is in Africa.
yes.
But they don't organize the same way we do.
I'm really curious about this now. Is there a model constitution, right, for the Lutheran Church in Ethiopia, right, or the Lutheran Church in Jordan and the Holy Land? I can actually ask Colin and Jenny whether there is.
But isn't that one reason we have ELCA, Missouri Synod?
Oh sure,
Yeah.
oh sure, yeah, absolutely. Because how many of you have had experiences with Missouri Synod churches? What does their organization look like?
Doesn't look Lutheran.
Well, it doesn't look ELCA, right? What is Lutheran?
It's very tough.
They look fundamentalist.
They have become, yeah, well, and I don't want to generalize, but yes, it definitely has become more. But even just in terms of the organization, do they have bishops? No.
Oh, I'm wrong.
No, they do not have bishops. What is the regional head of an LCMS synod called? District president. Yes.
Oh, man.
Yes. So they have hierarchy, but it's different, right? Paul, why do LCMS congregations, in your opinion, have district presidents instead of bishops?
Well, there's a reaction to the word bishop as an overseer because of the tradition of Roman Catholics.
Oh, right,
So
because
really
they're
it's a
super
reaction
freaky about
to
that, yeah.
And they're much more reactive to Catholicism than we are.
And this is, by the way, one of the things that LCMS congregations have in common with more evangelical expressions of Christianity is a reaction to Roman Catholicism. Yes. That's changed over time, especially around when people unite around issues that they're reactive against, they tend to cross boundaries of culture and practice, But yeah, you want to see some really anti-Catholic rhetoric. Go look at the history of Baptist denominations within the U.S.
Can't say sacrament, has to be ordinance.
Has to be ordinances, not sacraments. Yes, the sacrament is a Catholic word, right? Yeah. Where else do you see, heritage coming to the forefront within congregations?
But here locally, a few years ago, I went to the Synod Assembly in Sun River and ended up on the Synod mailing list. And if you go through, say, our weekly highlights, and then you compare that to the monthly newsletter that comes out of the Synod, you'd almost swear you're talking about two different churches. I mean, and it's not that it's just that the issues that they're addressing are far different from the stuff that we spend time thinking about here at the Milwaukie Lutheran.
Yeah. Yeah, and one of the big differences there too is that synod communications are primarily intended for leaders of churches, right? Not necessarily the laity. But yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, if you were to compare and contrast, for example, the things that Milwaukie Lutheran is concerned about, or concerned is the wrong word, the things that we communicate about versus communication to the synod, yeah, it's different, right? In some ways, theologically, politically, the whole 9 yards. What's interesting is to compare and contrast like newsletters and communications of different congregations, right, depending on where you're at. My home church will mail me a few times a year their newsletter. It's great. Sally Wong emails me news. She is not, by the way, of Asian heritage. It was Vang, W-A-N-G. Probably was originally V-A-N-G, and then when that Norwegian family immigrated to the United States, it was changed to Ellis Island or wherever they immigrated, it became W-O-N-G, Wong. Very confusing. But yeah, Sally hand mails me the Lear Lutheran newsletter, and it's great. And I love seeing the differences because it also highlights the differences in how that community is organized, right? They're a primarily lay-led congregation because they can't afford a full-time pastor. And so the things that they communicate are the things that are unique to what's going on with them, right? It's not a top-down communication of informing people of when services are happening and what events are going on. They all know when services are happening and what events are going on because they're doing it. Yeah. Heritage is another one of those things when we talk about the broad view, actually gains value in a lot of ways, right? So when we were talking about the broad view, this idea that my view of the world is restrictive, not in a negative way, but just understanding like I can only see so much, I can only experience so much. The question then is when you gain a broader view, what do you do with it, right? Do you react against it, or do you try to understand, appreciate it, right? And that's not to say that everything is good, right? Because that's also what our human brains are capable of doing. Is like saying, well, I like that, I don't like that. That seems good, that seems dangerous, right? That's how we survive. But there's also the unfortunate, which is everything that is outside my view is bad, right? Which is a temptation. But one of the things when we're able to have a broad view of the world, when we're able to see different ways of doing things, different ways of worshiping, practicing, believing, right? One of the things that I think we actually gain an appreciation for is the heritage of what our view has come from. It's one of the things that we struggle with in the ELCA, right? Is what are our cultural heritages? We've named them German, Scandinavian, yeah.
And do you want to split that up between Swedish and Norwegian?
Oh yeah, I was going to say even lumping these together is a relatively recent development, right?
And it's only northern
And it's only northern
Germany.
Germany, right? And believe it or not, there is a difference between Finns, Swedes, Danes, and Norwegians. We can't confuse that. But
Finns are not Scandinavian, depending on who you ask.
Oh, that's true. That's true. They're half Russian, right?
My great aunt was tormented.
Yeah.
When she married someone from Finland.
But this is a remarkable, comment in and of itself is that we're able to use these generalizations regarding our heritage, right? Where if you roll back the time, 100 years, you would have had to distinguish between Norwegian, Swedish, et cetera, et cetera.
Real quick on that, my father was Norwegian, my mother was Finnish, and both sides didn't understand that. As far as a broad view, I'm going to go out, many conversations I have, and it's almost an extreme broad view. I'll be talking to a very strong atheist.
Yes.
And it comes down to, do you have a spiritual life where everything is, and if I can just reach them on that discussion, spiritual life versus no spiritual life, that's for the broadest I get. And then you can start knocking down that spiritual life too, really deep.
I figured out what we're gonna do next week. We're gonna carry on this conversation. But this is it, right? Is that so often when we talk about, however you want to call it, religious versus atheist. The assumption here is that this is a purely religious commentary. But we've just had a conversation for the last hour about how so much of what we consider to be religious is actually cultural, right? The church, how it looks now, is culturally informed, okay? What happens if we apply that thinking to maybe these questions? Because we are existing in a world where we are watching are religious institutions in decline. And we're assuming that it's about theology. In some ways, in a lot of ways, it probably is, okay? But what happens when, let's say, your grandparents stop going to church? What's the likelihood that their children are going to go to church? It's less than before. What's the likelihood that their children are going to go to church? It's less than before. If you have not ever participated in any religious anything, what's it going to seem like? Totally weird, right?
Cultural shift.
100% cultural shift. Any religious experience. In the same way that if you're raised in Northeast Michigan, right, and your wife is raised in Southeast France, right, the things that you eat seem absolutely foreign, right? And maybe that's not a great comparison, but this is the question that we're missing in a lot of our conversations about, well, people don't want to come to church, and we assume it's because they don't believe, right? We assume it's because there isn't an inner spiritual life because they're atheists, right? And what if a lot of the things that are different between, for example, people of Milwaukie Lutheran and our neighbors across the way isn't just this? What if some of the things that we take for granted as religious stuff are actually cultural things, right, that are different between us? Because here's the thing, religion is a culture. Religion is a culture, right? We have strange things like Lenten soup suppers. Have you ever tried explaining those to somebody outside the church, right? Yeah, no, we get together on a Wednesday evening and everybody brings soup. Why? Well, it's Lent. We just do. But why? Is it a special time of the year? Well, yeah, but why is it a special time of the year? Well, it gets complicated because then you have to explain what Lent is. Well, Lent is the 40 days that leads up to Easter. It's usually kind of sad and somber. It starts with eating a lot of good food, right? On Maundy Thursday. Oh, yeah! Not Maundy Thursday. Mardi Gras. Yeah, like in New Orleans, right? With the beads and the flowers and the necklaces and all that stuff. Not really. Okay. This is what we're going to talk about next week. Fun stuff. See you guys in worship.
Table with Joe's all pick it up in the morning.
Hey. Hey, tomorrow. Are you still setting candidates? Last week, right? Last week. So many things I wanted to say. Well, instead of raising my hand, I'll ask right now.